Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and just get us started, get to introduce our guests for tonight. My name is Irina Reyn, and I'm the director of Pittsburgh Contemporary Writers Series. And this is our first event of 2022 to 23 season. And it's an exciting panel with our music journalists. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of a sense of who they are. And what we're going to do is the format will be that each writer will read a short passage from a recent article that they've written. And then we're going to have our moderator, Professor Peter Trachtenberg, come in and have a conversation with our panelists. And then after that, we will open it up to a Q&A. So please do store your questions, put them in chat. I'm going to go ahead and read the questions that come up in chat because this is not a webinar format. If you have something you want to follow up or say something to the panelists after I read your question, feel free to chime in during that moment. And that's our plan for tonight. Our next Pittsburgh Contemporary Writers Series event is going to be in person on October 27th at 7:30 at Frick Fine Arts Auditorium. And it's the short story writer Dantil Moniz, author of Milk Blood. He is going to be in Pittsburgh next month. So I hope some of you can come out and see our fiction writer in person. So now I'm going to introduce you to our panelists tonight. We have Will Hermes and Amanda Petrusich, who are here going to be speaking about music journalism. Will Hermes is the author of Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, 5 years in New York that changed music forever, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice of 2011. And he's finishing a biography of the American musician Lou Reed. That might come out sometime at the end of next year, perhaps. We're looking forward to that. A longtime contributor to NPR's All Things Considered. He's a contributing editor to Rolling Stone, and his work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Village Voice, Slate, Spin, The Believer, and has been featured twice in Da Capo's Best Music Writing series. Amanda Petrusich is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of 3 books. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction and has been nominated for a Grammy Award. Her criticism and features have appeared in the New York Times, the Oxford American, Spin, Pitchfork, GQ, Esquire, The Atlantic, Playboy, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. Her most recent book, Do Not Sell at Any Price, explored the obsessive world of 78 RPM record collectors. She's an associate professor in the writing program of NYU's Gallatin School. And we're going to have the panel be moderated by Professor Peter Trachtenberg, who's the author of the forthcoming The Last Artists in New York, along with 7 Tattoos, The Book of Calamities, and Another Insane Devotion. And as we know, he is our much beloved member of the nonfiction department, nonfiction and the writing program. So welcome panelists, and maybe why don't we go alphabetically and start with Will.
Let me unmute myself. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. This is really a joy to get a chance to talk about craft with folks who care about it, and also to to know that we are all so zoomed out, and that you would take your time to get on Zoom, and in the evening when you might be a little fried, I appreciate it. So I guess I'll just launch right into reading from, I was trying to figure out what to read, and I figured, what the heck, I'll jump into to the manuscript I'm working on, which is a Lou Reed biography that I've been working on for a really long time. Gosh, it's like close to 9 years now. Um, I've been doing other things too, but it's coming to a conclusion, and I figured I would just read a little bit of the beginning of the book. I'm going to read the preface. 2 days before he died, Lou Reed floated in the pale blue water of the heated swimming pool behind his East Hampton home. He was suffering. He had been for a while. His liver, an organ he'd worked hard over the years, had all but ceased to function. After a waiting period, he finally received a transplant, but now that liver was failing too. He knew that these were his final hours, but he was with Laurie Anderson, his wife, partner, and soulmate, and a steady stream of close friends had been visiting to hang out, laugh, weep, eat, drink, and listen to music. On this afternoon, too weak to swim, Reed was being cradled in the arms of his friend, the painter and filmmaker Julian Schnabel. A decade apart in age, the two artists had risen to fame on parallel New York tracks. Both had frequented Max's Kansas City, both befriended Andy Warhol, and shared his work ethic, making art as reflexively as breathing. In later years, Reed and Schnabel became close, and in 2005, they collaborated on a staged production of his Berlin LP, a record that Schnabel loved. Reed was fiercely proud of their project, which became a vindication. The 1973 album had been the dark follow-up to his breakout Transformer and its radio hit Walk on the Wild Side. And when it was first released, it was vilified by many. A Rolling Stone critic called it, quote, a disaster, unquote, and, quote, so patently offensive, unquote, the critic wanted to, quote, take physical vengeance, unquote, on its maker. But time brought a critical reassessment, as it did again and again with Reed's work. Presenting Berlin in opera houses across Europe, its magnificently grim song cycle, unspooling against Schnabel's handsome hanging murals, Reed dubbed them the Berlin Wall. The production turned perhaps the greatest disappointment of Reed's career into one of his greatest personal triumphs. Reed was raised in a seaside town on Long Island's South Shore. He knew the ocean well, invoked it in songs, and now, not far from where he grew up, buoyant in the swimming pool water, looking up at his large and hirsute friend, Reed recalled a moment as a child. You know, I was on the beach with my dad, Reed said, voice diminished to a hoarse whisper. I put my hand in his hand, and he smacked me in the face. That recollection of a mid-century Jewish dad harshly instructing a son in the fraught matter of how to be a man in an anti-Semitic, homophobic culture, one imagines, might well have been accurate. It might also have been delusional hyperbole, born of Reed's failing health and a lifetime of telling stories about himself that were not entirely true. Either way, Reed's friend thought it was a crazy thing. Here's a 71-year-old guy about to die, spending his final hours on Earth, and this is what he's thinking about. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Okay, and now Amanda.
Great. I just want to echo what Will said, thanking everybody for spending this time with us tonight. It is truly a pleasure. Will, that was amazing, a very thrilling glimpse at what I'm certain is going to be an extraordinary book. I am also going to read from something very new that has not been published, but will be published in the New Yorker later this fall. I've spent much of the last year reporting a profile on Metallica, which is a band that's not necessarily in my wheelhouse musically exactly, but a band that I've found fascinating, and a band that was turning 40 when I started reporting the story, is now in its 41st year. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of that piece. Funnily enough, Lou Reed and Metallica did make a record together that kind of also much critically reviled Lulu. So in some ways,
Yes.
Will, I feel like we're recreating that duet. Hopefully our duet will be less critically reviled. But coming on the heels of Lou, here's Metallica. The merch preceded them. 48 hours before Metallica performed in Las Vegas, restaurants and bars along the strip were crammed full of pilgrims dressed in branded gear. T-shirts, jerseys, sweatshirts, sneakers, tank tops, hats, beanies, socks, wristwatches. The most grizzled devotees wore fraying denim vests decorated with several decades of patches. Metallica's licensing team estimates that about 120 million Metallica t-shirts have been sold since 1995. The motifs are iconic. There's the one where a hand clutching a dagger emerges from a toilet alongside the phrase, "metal up your ass." There's the one where a skull is wearing scrubs and performing brain surgery with a fork, a knife, and its fangs. There's the one where the skull has a fistful of stumpy straws and is announcing, "the shortest straw has been pulled for you." You get the idea. Metallica is now in its 41st year. The band was a progenitor, along with Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth, of thrash, a subgenre of heavy metal marked by thick, suffocating riffs, played with astonishing speed. Lyrical themes tend to include death, despair, power, desperation, grief, and wrath. Though metal is often dismissed as underground music, frantic, savage, and niche, Metallica has sold some 125 million records to date, putting the band on par commercially with Bruce Springsteen and Jay-Z. It is the only musical group to have performed on all 7 continents in a single calendar year. Since 1990, all of Metallica's albums have debuted at #1 in more than 30 countries. In 2009, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by Flea, the bassist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He described Metallica's music as this beautiful, violent thing that was unlike anything I'd heard before in my life, and called its motivation pure. This is outsider music, and for it to do what it has done is truly mind-blowing, he said. It is the only metal group to have its music added to the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress. Kim Kardashian has been photographed in a Metallica shirt on at least 2 occasions. Beavis sported one for the entire 9-season run of Beavis and Butthead. Though the band has made adjustments to its sound over the years, some minor, some seismic, all irritating to certain subsets of its fan base, it's hard to think of another act that has outlasted the whims of the culture with such vigor. Metallica are the Marines of metal, Scott Ian, a co-founder of Anthrax, told me recently. First one in, last one out. The band's current lineup includes the singer and rhythm guitarist James Hetfield and the drummer Lars Ulrich, who co-founded the band, the lead guitarist Kirk Hammett, who joined in 1983, and the bassist Robert Trujillo, a member since 2003. Hetfield, 59, tall, graying at the temples, moves with the confident saunter of a well-armed cowboy. Ulrich, 58, radiates so much kinetic energy that it's hard to imagine him yawning. Hammett, 59, and Trujillo, 57, are the band's gentle, long-haired surfers, jazz enthusiasts disinclined to dramatics. If Hetfield is Metallica's heart, its musical center and primary lyricist, Ulrich is its brain, a visionary who instinctively understands cultural terrain. The night before the Vegas show, the band gathered at Allegiant Stadium to rehearse. A scrum of about a dozen people, mostly from Metallica's touring crew, stood on the floor to watch. Derek Carr, the quarterback for the Las Vegas Raiders, appeared, looking as though he were resisting an intense urge to play air guitar. Some clients of the private plane company NetJets sat in the stands, enjoying specialty cocktails and cheering. Even in a mostly empty stadium, the band sounded powerful, lucid, heavy. The next afternoon, a pre-show tailgate event was scheduled for the House of Blues, somewhere in the belly of the Mandalay Bay Casino. I sent a series of increasingly disoriented texts to a friend. I'm in the casino, where are you? I'm in the casino, before we finally found each other. We were both wearing vintage t-shirts featuring the graveyard-themed cover art from Master of Puppets, the band's third album. Under different circumstances, this might have been a cause for mild embarrassment, but here it merely felt apropos. We lined up at the bar for plastic cups of the band's owned blackened whiskey, a bourbon rye blend that's finished in brandy casks while Metallica's albums blare from large speakers. It tasted nice. You could feel an anticipatory flutter in the air. COVID-19 grounded Metallica for large stretches of 2020 and 2021. My backstage pass featured a skull with a wispy mohawk self-administering a COVID test. The results, of course, were positive. Fans were slapping one another on the back, hooting about how much they had missed this. The feeling was, let's pop off. People were ready to have a good ass time, to drink too many beers, to forget their earplugs, to buy a new Metallica t-shirt with demons on it and wiggle it on over an old Metallica t-shirt with demons on it, to headbang, to contort their fingers into devil horns and thrust them upward, to go ah when the pyro shoots off. From afar, it's easy to see Metallica and other violent music as an instigating force, an accelerant turning unruly hooligans more unruly. But that idea alone can't sustain a devoted following for more than 40 years. As we sipped our whiskey, my companion, August Thompson, a Metallica fan since his boyhood in rural New Hampshire, told me his favorite lyric from Escape, a dense and charging song from Ride the Lightning. Life's for my own, to live my own way. Hetfield repeats the sentiment with slightly different phrasing in Nothing Else Matters, a song from Metallica. Life is ours, we live it our way. It makes sense that people are drawn to Metallica's music because they too feel like outsiders, ill at ease in a culture that relentlessly valorizes things, money, straight teeth, love. It is very easy to be born without. That night, Metallica opened its set with Whiplash, a punchy, pummeling song from Kill 'Em All, its debut album. On the floor, mosh pits periodically arose. From the stands, they resembled tiny riptides, bodies circling one another, sometimes submitting to a menacing current, but mostly just orbiting. If you squinted, it almost looked like an ancient folk dance, something that might happen at a Greek wedding, late, after people had been drinking. I think the best seat in the arena is the second tier up, where you get to see the band, but you also get to see all the fans, Hetfield told me later. Forget the band, look at the audience. These days, the set list is mostly old songs and the vibe is largely benevolent. Hetfield's voice is low and scratchy and can shift from contemplative to feral in a single note. He is prone to ending his phrases with a tight, curled snarl. He can still transform the word yeah into a vast and terrifying invocation. He can be tender and earnest, which has recently led fans to start calling him Papa Het. This song goes out to all who struggle, Hetfield said before Fade to Black, a slow and aching ballad about suicide. If you think you're the only one, it's a lie. You can talk to your friends, talk to somebody, because you are not alone. The band closed its encore with Enter Sandman, another single from Metallica. Even if metal is not your bag, it's hard to deny the menacing perfection of its opening riff. An E minor chord, a wah-wah pedal, a sense that something dark and creepy is about to transpire. During the chorus, I looked over at Thompson, who had the dazed and exuberant look of someone who had been cured of a disease by an itinerant preacher. All around us, people were enraptured, ecstatic, free. The reason we do this, the reason Tina Turner does it, the reason anybody fucking does it is to make an exchange with other human beings, Jason Newsted, who played bass in Metallica from 1986 to 2001, told me. You've been given this gift. You can transport people with sound. It just floats through the air, he said, his voice incredulous. It's not water, it's not food. It just floats through the air. I get up there and sing and I watch people change, is how Hetfield described it. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, Peter, I'll invite you to have a conversation.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Two very different text that just blew me away. And I want to start by saying what an honor it is to be sharing a virtual stage with you and a conversation with you. And I'm going to start by just asking a question about what kind of musician do you find it most productive to write about? Somebody you love, somebody you hate, a musician who's got one irremediable flaw that gnaws at you? And this is for both of you.
It's a great question. Will, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, for me, really, almost always one that I love. I mean, I got into this game because I love music and I love writing, and I write to share the pleasure and joy of the experience of music, to try and channel it and hopefully like deeper a reader's experience of that music, whether it's like through framing, context, history, background, roots, jokes, like the way you crack wise like during a concert in somebody's ear, and even criticism. I think good criticism is an act of love. Like you are, you're looking to see the best, and other people are good at writing about people they don't like. I, in general, don't think there's, a need for putting out more hate in the world. But at the same time, like every once in a while, there'll be something that comes along that I might feel is particularly toxic. And, that can be fun to write about. But in general, I like to dwell in places that are pleasurable. There's so much music that's so good that needs to be shouted out. I like to do that whenever I can, and I really see writing about music as a portal to writing about everything. So there's plenty of opportunities to explore the good, the bad, and the ugly in writing about musicians that I really like.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful answer, Will. And I agree with you. I think, for me, probably the number one thing these days is that I have to be genuinely curious, I think, about someone or something. I found that I'm not very good at faking that. You can kind of fake a lot in the context of the work, but for me, if I'm asking questions where I don't really care what the answers are, I'm in trouble right off the bat. So I think the idea of finding something interesting is also, in my mind, a little bit separate, I think, at this point from the idea of finding something good. There can be music where I think, all right, this isn't what I'm going to put on after I come home from a long day and, just want to sort of zone out on the couch and feel good. Sometimes I can find something compelling without necessarily wanting to, participate in it, I suppose. And I think sometimes maybe it helps me to not be a fan. Like, I think sometimes it helps to have just a little bit of critical distance so that I can kind of zoom the camera all the way out and sort of objectively and with a lot of curiosity and a lot of earnestness kind of assess whatever is going on. But for the most part, I think I'm totally in the same zone as Will, where it is really an extension or an act of love. I think it is, something moves me in this really mysterious kind of ephemeral way. And I want to understand it first. And then second, I really want to share it with other people and say, this is how I've kind of come to understand how this thing works and why it's important and why it's beautiful. And here's what it did for me. And maybe it'll do that for you too, I think is the kind of enduring impulse behind it.
So both of you are justly famous for your profiles of people like Lou Reed and Arthur Russell and Adrian Linker and Sean Marshall. What are you trying to accomplish when you write a profile? How do you gain an artist's trust, especially when that artist is somebody who's been burned by other journalists? And how do you tell the truth about an interlocutor? And that's a word I use instead of subject for both ethical and aesthetic reasons. without betraying their trust in you?
I'd love to hear Amanda go in on this, because I just think you do it so good, creating a sense of intimacy and realness in your profiles.
Oh, that's so kind, Will. I will say I chiefly write profiles these days. That is sort of the form I have landed on at this phase in my career. And I think, Peter, your question is a really astute one, because artists probably should be a little suspicious of journalists. And likewise, journalists should probably be a little suspicious of artists, because your agendas in that moment do not necessarily align.
Yeah.
And that being said, for me, I find profile writing to be the most complicated and most interesting kind of magazine writing. I think in part because it's the messiest and it's the most human. And I think when you sort of land and, you get off the plane and you check into your hotel and you get in your rental car and you drive to someone's house and you've never met them before, there's still like first date energy. I don't know how else to describe it. It's like, is this person going to like me? Is the conversation going to feel fluid and easy? Will they laugh at my jokes? Will we order a second round of drinks? Will they text me? What's their astrological sign? It's like a lot of, I don't know. I think for it to work, you both have to sort of loosen your grip a little bit. I think I have to stop thinking like, holy cow, I'm swimming in Biscayne Bay with Iggy Pop, or I'm eating oysters with Phoebe Bridgers. Holy shit. I have to let go of that voice. And I think they have to kind of let go of the idea that, every last thing I say right now is going to appear in a national magazine and be scrutinized by zillions of people. So you're both kind of, I think, letting that kind of float away and trying to have a real kind of consciousness to consciousness connection, like a real human interaction where you're getting to know each other a little bit. I do think it's important that the person being written about comes to trust that you are trying to tell a real story, that they will be able to recognize themselves in the words on the page, and that you are there to actually listen to what they're telling you. It's funny, Well, I'm curious about your sort of approach to this in like a nuts and bolts sense. I used to do so much research before I left on a reporting trip. I wanted to know everything I could possibly know about my subject. And I think I also sort of wanted to know the kind of story I was going to tell, before I got on the plane. I wanted to have that structure in place. And part of that is maybe a byproduct of pitching, because editors will often want to know, like, well, what's your angle?
Right.
I don't know. I haven't met the person yet. So I'm going to just sort of manufacture some angle so I can get the assignment and get the job. And then I'll just cling to it like, a panicked child. But now that
or ditch it all together and just, I got the assignment now, so I can go to town.
It is the way to go, though. I think you really want to go in with sort of eyes wide open, like no preconceived ideas about kind of who this person is or what their work means, and really let them tell you. I don't know. Has that been your experience too, Will?
Well, I tend to over research everything, like to a ridiculous degree. I think sometimes to a fault. I get too lost in, that going in. I've done a number of features over the years, and I really enjoyed it. It's something that I don't like doing unless I really have time and access. And this is in general, time and access to do it right. And, I think back to, and a lot of this is the economics of journalism these days. Also, the ecosystem of just online journalism with now artists used to have to entertain maybe, having writers from half a dozen or a dozen publications. Now it's like 100 publications that might want to spend time with them, and there's social media so they can kind of get their narratives out on their own without a journalist. But, I think back to stories that I did for Spin, one on Sigur Rós, where I went to Reykjavik to spend a bunch of time with them. Sigur Rós, an Icelandic rock band, psychedelic rock band, who are just great. And I spent a week there. I sort of I widened my lens to write about the Reykjavik music scene, and which of course includes Björk, who is one of my real heroines, and that was really satisfying. Similarly, I did a story on Connor Oberst back when he was Bright Eyes, and then he became Bright Eyes again. And that was like a week and a half hanging out in Omaha, excuse me, and doing a piece on the entire this rock scene, pop scene that was exploding in Omaha at the time, an indie scene that was really exciting. And going to, I did a story on Tori Amos where I got to spend like a bunch of days with her in her home out in the moors. But that's hard to always get, because now, a lot of things get limited to a publicist saying, okay, well, here's your hour audience, or your, phone conversation, and do a feature from that, which, I am totally not above making exceptions to that. Like when Kate Bush wanted to jump on the phone for a New York Times feature I did, I was like, yeah, I'm in. She wants to talk for 5 minutes, I'll make it work. Or Bruce Springsteen too, which I got to hang out in Asbury Park, and I only really got to like chat with him for a short amount of time, also for the New York Times. But then you're doing something that's kind of circumscribed. But it's messy and it's fun, and it's when you can do it right, it's very satisfying.
Well, have you ever, in the middle of a profile, discovered either that the person you were writing about is sort of a horrible or very disappointing human being, or conversely, that they are willing to go to a deep place with you, a place deeper than what you anticipated? And what do you do in those cases?
Yeah, I feel like I'm fortunate, and it sounds like I'm lying, but I'm not. I feel like I haven't had like a true monster kind of emerge. Maybe artists these days are just sort of too savvy to, to show that side to a journalist. I do think, as we were saying earlier, a lot of this kind of work can be sort of ego management. And sometimes you're sort of tiptoeing around, an artist's ego. But I haven't had anyone be truly terrible. I've had a few people open up in ways that I found extraordinary and disarming and surprising. I did a piece for the New Yorker on Brittany Howard, who is the singer of the Alabama Shakes. She left that band, put out what I thought was a really incredible solo record. And I thought she seemed cool and interesting, and I liked her band, and I loved her solo record. And
yeah.
And she was someone who I just was so immediately kind of shocked and in some ways sort of seduced by her honesty and her openness. And she's had a complicated, difficult life. She's thoughtful about it, and she's thoughtful about her work. And it was kind of returning to what Will had said about access and time. It was, I'd spent some time with her in LA. She was performing at the Grammys, and we kind of hung out at, this wild Airbnb she was renting out there, drank a million White Claws and, ordered noodles and just had a fun, great time together, swam. And then I spent some time with her in Nashville a little bit later that year where she lives. And then we'd spent some time together in Alabama, where she took me to her hometown, and I got to meet her family and cousins, and we had barbecue with her dad. And, I saw the trailer where she had grown up, and I saw the junkyard that surrounded the trailer, and all these things that were, she used to be a postal service delivery person. And
Yeah.
I got to go along her old mail route. And I was so kind of overwhelmed by how open she was with me, and also just what an incredible and strong and interesting person she was. But I came home and wrote this profile that was just so sort of effusive, and I think so filled with kind of gratitude for the experience I'd had with her. She's so funny and she's so smart, that my editor was like, you need to complicate this. Like, he sort of very right. It was a great editorial note where he very rightly kind of called me out on you drank the Kool-Aid a little too much. Like you had too much fun with Brittany Howard over the last 6 months. And like, we need to complicate her. Like she's a human being. She's not, you know, the funniest, smartest person. So we walk there the way that you were presenting her on the page. So I had to sort of dial it back a little, which happens sometimes.
That's super interesting to hear because I did a feature on the Alabama Shakes before, really like at the when they just put out their first album for Rolling Stone. And yeah, she's just an amazing woman. And it was interesting to, you know, see her in the context of that band. So I can totally see where you were coming from.
Like she's a force of nature, so open.
She is a force of nature, yeah.
Also just a fun hang, you know. Just, yeah. So sometimes getting along with someone really well, I think, can make the job harder.
I mean, that profile is a wonderful profile because it really does convey the sense you're not that aware of the journalist, but you are aware of somebody who is, you know, who is complicated, who is charismatic, and to me, deeply lovable. And profoundly good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is interesting, and this is more of an issue with artists who are very young, just coming into the game. I've had certain situations where people will, you know, really share intense stuff with you. I mean, not overshare, particularly like you're touched that they're opening themselves up to you and trusting you in the course of a feature interview. But you're not 100% sure that what they tell you is something that they'd be comfortable sharing. So in a way, you're sort of, you know, I feel a responsibility that, you know, obviously, you know, Amanda, you said that, you know, journalists and artists, you know, have different agendas, but I always want to feel that like I'm, you know, cognizant of when a young artist particularly might be sharing something that they will ultimately regret seeing in a national magazine. So I'm, you know, I take that responsibility very seriously is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I feel like, well, that's something I learned even from reading you and being such a fan of your work, that I don't know, that humanity, that kind of generosity, the patience that sometimes you have with your subjects, I think is such a beautiful thing. And I think, you know, in many cases, it's really well earned. But I've had that experience too. Sometimes you sort of sit down with someone, and I think the journalist subject relationship I know I used a first date metaphor earlier, so now I'm going to mix my metaphors and say there are moments too where it feels like therapy, you know, and it's like, well, tell me about your mother, you know. And so there is this kind of intimacy that sort of builds the more time you're talking to someone and you're really interested in what they're saying and you're asking all these questions and you're not talking about yourself. And I think there is a kind of sense of safety that sometimes emerges where they do sort of forget what you're there to do. And I think you're right to kind of acknowledge that later on when you're kind of picking what goes in and what doesn't. Like, how do I sort of be human about this? And how do I be kind about this, you know, where somebody may have said something that you know is going to haunt them if you print it. And is that really what you're here to do? And I did a piece many years ago. It was a profile of Sean Marshall, who records his Cat Power. And I was
great piece, by the way, just saying.
She had just gone through like a very gnarly breakup with the actor Giovanni Ribisi. They'd been together a long time, and they'd just broken up, and then he had married this young British model. It was like a very heartbreaking moment for her. And I remember sitting there talking to her and you know, it's like that moment right after a breakup where you're so vulnerable, you know, you're so messed up and you don't even know what's coming out of your mouth. I felt so conscious of that later on. Like, how do I untangle this so we're not kind of throwing things out into the world that, you know, don't need to be out there. But yeah, it's a weird dance sometimes.
Okay, on a related subject, I'm sure that many of the questions you get asked are of the what does so-and-so really like variety. I mean, was Lou Reed really a junkie? Is Taylor Swift really as nice as she seems, or is she a bitch? And my question is, can we draw a line between the musician and their character? And to what extent are the musicians that you're writing about expressing who they really are, or a persona that they've crafted? And are we supposed to view that persona as like fake or a deception, or as an artistic production, like the character a short story writer produces?
Huh.
It's another good question, Peter. These are such thoughtful.
That is a great question.
Well, it's really a Lou question in a way.
Well, that is totally fair, because I was jotting down notes. We sort of sketched out some of these questions in advance, and my notes on this question were Dylan, Joni, Lou, who I actually think are like three of the people who really shaped what modern songwriting became, certainly in terms of like authorial voice. I wrote that Dylan exploded the notion of authorial voice in songwriting. Joni blueprinted, pun intended, the modern idea of songwriting as memoir, and Lou did the same for songwriting as fiction or creative nonfiction. And he would always argue, this is writing. Don't read memoir into my songs. But then he'd also talk about things being informed by memoir and write stuff that was clearly memoir ish. So yeah, I guess my feeling is it's a moving target, and it's different for every artist. And I think it's always a mistake to read any lyrics as straight memoir. I think it's always a mistake to think they have nothing to do with the real life of the artist. And in terms of in terms of the person, the person is the person, and the art is a word that comes from artifice, I guess. Amanda, what do you?
Such a good answer. Well, I don't know how to on that answer. I do think, for any public facing artist, that that character, whoever they are on stage, whoever they are on social media, whoever they are in interviews, it is inevitably an extension of the work. I'm sure someone could argue it sort of is the work. I think we as a culture are not very good at divorcing those things, for better or worse. So it's all part of the same package. Art and artist, it's a very permeable membrane. I think for some very lucky, very healthy artists, the line between persona and person is clear and definitive. But I think in general, it's probably much more complicated. That sort of idea that after a while, the mask becomes your face. And I think, sometimes the artist themselves sort of doesn't quite know or understand where one thing ends and the other begins. And it can be quite lonesome. The Metallica piece that I read a little bit from earlier, I spoke quite a bit with James Hetfield, who's the singer of Metallica, who's been doing this for 40 years, about sort of what that is, and we were talking about the idea of family, and, he was saying well, the fans are kind of a family, but also they don't know me. And I was like, sure, they know the version of you that exists in the work. And he said something to me, which I quote in the piece, which was, yeah, and which version is that? And I thought, God, the sort of psychic disorientation of that experience is so intense. And I think it is hard to have a huge amount of compassion for the rich and the famous, especially these days. But I don't envy them that. And I've never talked to a rock star who was not sort of acutely aware that the love their audience has for them is rooted in a kind of mirage, a kind of fantasy. They're hyper aware of that. I think it's weird. It's got to be such a weird experience to be famous. That's my very smart observation this evening.
No doubt. It's interesting. I mean, I have a friend, Terry Sutton, who was really one of my mentors as as a young journalist, and she's a good friend. And I remember her saying, she's also a music and literary critic that I really admire. And I remember her, we were talking about a piece and that she had written, and she said, like, yeah, I'm not sure that Terry Sutton was entirely me. So even critics and journalists, I think, I have a sense sometimes that, you're a little bit different on the page than you are in real life sometimes. And maybe that's the appeal of it, in part. So, but it's slippery. It's slippery.
Oh, Peter, I think you're still muted.
I am. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
One of the things that distinguishes bread and butter music journalism, I mean, the people who say, buy this album, don't buy that album, go see this gig, not that gig. And the kind that you write is, I think, the pursuit and articulation of meaning. And what I want to know, is this what you had in mind when you, at the outset of your careers? Is this something that happened to you as you continue to write?
Well, that's a flattering question, Peter. I appreciate that. I think, for me at least, and I'm very curious to hear Will's thoughts on this too. I think the idea of criticism as, simply a thing where a person of kind of great authority and expertise sort of declares works of art good and bad, to me, that always felt a little bit like uncomfortable. I didn't want to do that kind of writing. At least when I was coming up, that was still sort of largely the mode that music criticism operated in. There were certainly exceptions to it, but I think that kind of qualitative idea of sort of looking down from on high and saying like, well, this is good and this is bad. I thought, well, there's got to be maybe a more kind of complicated or interesting way to do this work. The experience of music is so subjective, it's so circumstantial, it evolves, it's complicated, and I think I was less interested in judging something than I was in understanding it. And that for me was a selfish impulse. I was so obsessed with music. I loved it. It changed me. I just wanted to understand that. I think I wanted to know what it meant. And I should, to be clear, I have failed at all of these things I'm saying I wanted to do, but it was always kind of the aspiration, maybe succeeded at times, but failed a lot of times too. But the hope was always to be able to get at something bigger and more interesting, to kind of try to understand what something means in the most expansive sense possible. Felt to me like more useful and more interesting work than just the sort of like thumbs up, thumbs down mode of criticism.
Yeah, that I always tried to short circuit that in a way, and I guess a lot of it was through practicing criticism by making connections, making historical connections, making cultural connections, and I guess from the get-go, like I always saw music as lyrics anyway, but music in general as like a way to learn about the world. And so when I was listening to like Yes albums as a teenager, I remember like seeing something about the autobiography of a yogi in the liner notes to Close to the Edge, and seeking that book out, and listening to Chuck D name check Malcolm X, and following up by reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and really, I was thinking about lyrics as hyperlinks, even though hyperlinks didn't exist, and I wouldn't have known what they were. I mean, when they were invented, but like I saw the poetry of lyrics as a text I wanted to unpack, So I was always like writing about music in that sense, to like learn not just about the music, but also about, about sort of what informed it, and, making the connections. So yeah, I was always like looking to find, find meaning. I mean, it was like, it's kind of a cliche to talk about music as religion, but like I sort of looked at like, as music as as sacred, and lyrics as sacred texts, if those aren't too overblown words. And and yeah, and the thumbs up, thumbs down, is is like a currency, not just of the internet, because it was certainly a thing before that, but it's it's reductive, and it's soundbitey, and that's why I like writing at length, because it lets you explore these things. So yeah.
Yeah,
And
well, I think what you said about the, the context and the sort of idea that music doesn't just kind of emerge from a vacuum, that it is the product, all art is kind of the product of the person who made it, and the things that formed them, and where they come from, and who they are. And getting the chance to kind of untangle that is a privilege and a thrill. It's, it's very true.
Yeah, and I never, I mean, I've traveled, I've been fortunate enough to travel to a whole bunch of places over the years, but like, one of the things that I really was drawn to as a writer early on was writing about international music, both as a way to, turn people on to music that was really exciting to me, the unfortunate, but nevertheless commonplace for a while marketing term world music, was created space for a lot of international artists to be heard in the States, and writing about music by Franco or Tabule Rochereau or Fela Kuti or King Sunny Ade, any of the great African artists, certainly the great Jamaican artists in Latin America, the salsa scene that I wrote about in Love Goes to Buildings on Fire, which is rooted in New York, above all, though it went global. Ultimately, there are people who are, more well versed in these topics, who can write about them from different perspectives. But when then this enters into another thing that we were talking about earlier. It was these were avenues that I felt were like worth exploring, because it was music I felt it was important for people to hear, and wanted to explore it.
well, I've got a last question, which may be frivolous and may not be. Is there a musician, current or past, to whom you especially relate and whose albums you feel are secretly written and recorded just for you? And who are they?
Amanda?
Metallica, obviously. I love Metallica, but for me, this is sort of, I feel like it's kind of a lame answer, but it's Bob Dylan. I mean, he was sort of my first musical love. I think the first records that I heard where I thought, like, I can't believe other people, another person sort of has these like terrible, sort of fraught thoughts. I think has been sort of a beacon in my life, and is probably the one songwriter that I just, feel like an almost uncanny kind of sense of kinship with. I mean, that sounds like I'm flattering myself. I don't think that we have a lot in common but he's someone whose work just resonates for me on every level. It always has. I love it instinctively. I loved it instantly. I will love it forever. I mean, that's just, yeah, he's the one for me.
Right on. And for me, Lou Reed, obviously, although specifically Velvet Underground era Lou Reed. You know, I'm not trying to compare myself to him in any way, but like we do share a little bit of background. I grew up 15 miles away from where he grew up. And we grew up, white middle class dudes in a similar era, though we were separated by decades, and similar experiences in a lot of life experiences. And those lyrics always just, of the first I'll Be Your Mirror, and almost all the third album. So much stuff that really, really spoke to me. And there were other artists. I mean, Michael Stipe, I'll always have a place in my heart. There was something about like how he smeared his vocals that just like allowed I responded to the tone and the delivery, and that delivery allowed me in to the lyrics. It kind of allows you to project things. I like when certain artists do that. Bob Mould was another one who just like his screaming tone, like just felt like struck me very personally. Nick Drake's records will always be very, very special to me. Like beginning of COVID, like those records were my go-to records. I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah, it never fails to music never fails to like help me feel connected to the world at large. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. Let me pop in and just say thanks, Peter, for having such a great conversation. And I just wanted to open up the floor a little bit to our Q&A and to people in the audience. We have a couple of questions in chat. One that just sort of follows up on what you were talking about right now, which is, the people that you love. And this last question is about, do you feel that working on a piece, this is from Evelyn, about a band or musician you love would take away from the music, the magic of the music? Is there, a situation in which, you were passionate about somebody and you had to write about them, and I guess for whatever reason or another, something about that experience had soured you on the music?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. Is anything popping to mind immediately for you? I have to think about it for a second. I mean, I think, Evelyn, you're right that it is a risk. I mean, there's always the risk that the person's going to be kind of a big stinker and that's going to sort of sour your experience of their work. Or there's a risk that, there's going to be some song that you loved and you thought it was written about, heartache or whatever. And then it turns out it was written about, their hamster or something, and there's always something in the recording process that can sort of shatter your hopes and dreams for a song. I don't know. Is there someone that comes to mind immediately for you, Will, where you thought?
No, not really. I mean, it's it's a good question, and it's always a little odd meeting people that first and foremost through their art. And I guess now there's social media too, but usually if meeting the person doesn't go that well, I usually chalk it up to just like the awkwardness of the journalistic situation, or maybe to the fact that they're having a bad day. mostly, I think that if you approach, and it's very easy to do, I think if you get to the point where you're doing this regularly, where you are, meeting a person as another person, and you're not like, talking to the persona, that usually it enhances your love of the music more than diminishes it. So
yeah, for sure. And I will say, artists, and I say this with a lot of love and respect and admiration, artists are not always the best representatives of their own work, and they're also not always the best interpreters of their own work. There is this sort of thought that like the thing is made and it exists in the world, and kind of what it means to you is what it is. So I don't often ask musicians kind of, well, what's that song about, or what did this mean, or what was this lyric? Maybe I should more. I don't know. Do you find yourself asking those really granular questions, Will, of like, well, what inspired this, or what did this lyric mean, or can you kind of break this down for me?
I try to avoid questions like that, and it really varies from artist to artist. But, I've been thinking about this a lot with regard to Lou Reed, because he was a notoriously difficult interviewee. He, in a lot of cases, and if having, really read through the interviews, this was not always the case, but he has a reputation as being the most difficult musician to interview ever in history. And like, you can get online and find videos of him just like eviscerating journalists, like humiliating them. But very often, like, I'm sorry, it was earned. Like, you totally get it. He was burned by journalists. He was burned by critics who were like pathologically obsessed with his persona. Not that they weren't also, good interpreters of it. I think of Lester Bangs, Peter Loftner. But yeah, I just, I feel like you're better off talking about stuff in general. Some people like talking about their lyrics and what inspired them specifically, and other people don't. So.
Okay, we have a question earlier on here about if you were both going to do a story on the Beatles, what would you write about them? Maybe you could shed some light into sort of the thinking that would go into crafting something like that.
Wow.
Have you ever interviewed a Beatle, Will?
I have never interviewed a Beatle, but I did take my daughter to see Ringo Starr and his all-star band, and Paul McCartney at later stages of their careers, and that was a lot of fun. But no, and I shout out Rob Sheffield, who is doing some of the greatest writing on the Beatles, still to this day after all these years. Colleague at Rolling Stone, but no, I'd have to think about that. They were a band that meant a lot to me, but were not super central to my, musical universe. They were just sort of, they were somewhere else. They were kind of like, I don't know. They were up on Mount Olympus, and I didn't.
You were down in the gutter.
I didn't engage. Yeah, exactly.
No, it's a great question, Pascal. And I think, one of the tricks of this, and Will, maybe you can speak on this in a more general way. I'm trying to think about it in a more general way. Writing about an artist like the Beatles, that's so, they're so iconic. Like there's just thousands of pages of writing that already exists on the
Yes.
How do you get a kind of a fresh, how do you sort of find purchase within that? How do you get a fresh take on this? How do you find a way to interpret the work that isn't just kind of repeating what's already happened. It's always hard. I mean, I've mentioned Dylan before as being one of my favorite artists, and he's someone still making records that I think are really fascinating and rich and good. And every time I sit down to write about one, I think, oh my God, how in 2022 do I write about Bob Dylan and find something new to say, about this guy and his work? And I think the same is true of the Beatles. It's sort of, how do you find a new lens, with which to kind of look through this and understand it? And it's really hard. And I think, maybe that's one of those moments where you say, like, all right, I don't need to add to the millions of words on this, especially, I'm blanking on the name. What was the documentary that came out earlier this year that was just like 8 hours of making Abbey Road? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not Let It Be, but it was actually wasn't it the making of Let It Be?
Oh, yes, sorry.
It was Peter, his anyway.
It was in the chat. Pascal was referencing that very thing, I think, at the Apple. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, which was unbelievable, like an amazing 8 hours.
I mean, how do you write something more revealing than that? It's like, I almost think if I got the assignment to write about the Beatles, I would just hand in, get back, just watch this. I can't top this. I can't possibly even approach this in terms of sort of revealing something interesting about how that band worked.
Yeah, I think a lot of times in writing about iconic artists like that, it's like, I like thinking about how their work resonates now. Like, this is now. That work was made quite a long time ago. Some people in the Zoom, might not be familiar with their work or not that familiar. So how has it resonated down the years? Writing the epilogue for the Lou Reed book. And in fact, the whole inspiration for the Lou Reed book, because he's been written about a lot. Oh my gosh. Like there's just like Dylan, just like the Beatles, there's been a lot of ink spilled on Lou Reed. But what, when he died, and I saw the fan response online, and it happened just around the time that like hashtags became a thing. And it was like on my radar, it was like the first great online fan outpouring, or at least one of the that I really like spun my head around, like how people were opening up about like how much Lou Reed meant to them, and how much it is, just what a rite of passage his music was. And that kind of inspired me. So with like the Beatles, I think, I maybe the same approach would be good.
Well, let me ask 2 more questions. One from Lily in the chat is, how do you not allow fangirling to get in the way of interviewing and portraying these artists realistically and honestly? So I don't know if you have any tips, like, I don't know, you drink if it involves alcohol, or other tips of being cool. So if there's anything there that you talk to, and then we'll finish up with, the job question, since I think a lot of people in the audience might be curious to know how you get into this. We have a question from us here about how do you settle into music journalism?
The fangirling question is a good one. How do you sort of, as people who kind of really love and have devoted our lives in many ways to music, how do you sort of not just short circuit when confronted with, an artist you really love and admire? I think maybe with time that gets a bit easier, or you sort of professionalize it in such a way where you're there, to do a particular kind of job, and you have to be sort of focused. But it is, I interviewed Paul McCartney once, speaking of the Beatles, and I remember it was at, his offices in New York, and it was one of those buildings where the elevator just kind of opens like right into the space. And I think I was expecting the elevator to open and there would be like a receptionist or something. I don't know what I was thinking. Open, and Paul McCartney was right there. And I remember this was the most sort of acute experience of this that I've ever had. I remember just gasping, just like it was so, I don't know, I was so overwhelmed by the kind of how surreal it felt, and how kind of large he loomed in my consciousness and the consciousness of many music fans. And I had to kind of catch my breath for a second to do the job I was there to do. And I think it is just sort of practice. You learn to kind of set that aside and say, like, all right, I'm here to talk to you kind of human to human and sort of figure out some things about each other. And then I will return home and kind of report back on that to my readers. But yeah, but it is hard. I think it just gets easier with time, sort of avoiding being starstruck or avoiding kind of getting totally tongue-tied because you just can't believe this person's right in front of you. I used to get so nervous before interviews. Well, and I'm curious to know if you do. I don't as much anymore, but there is still that little, again, to return to the kind of first date metaphor, there is still that little flutter in my stomach every time when I sit down with someone. Like, how's this going to go? What are they going to be like? Are they going to like me? Is it going to be okay?
No, every time.
Yeah, yeah.
Every time. I mean, weirdly, it's easier in person, I think. Usually just like having another human being in front of me is just like, it's like Bruce Springsteen. I was like, this is a guy who I've, been listening to and admiring for like decades. And, now and here he is in front of me. But, that you turn that off and you do your thing. I was hopelessly fanboying. I don't know. It was hard. Getting on the phone with Kate Bush, because I loved her music so deeply for so long and had just convinced myself that, like, she was also like, she was somewhere else up on Olympus. And of course she was like, total normcore mom, which is like a big part of her story. And Johnny Cash on the phone, I have to say, was like, hello, Will, this is Johnny Cash. Was like, I kind of, my teeth dropped, to paraphrase Bob Dylan, on first hearing Joan Baez sing. Anyway, yeah, sometimes I always get the flutters, but it gets easier with practice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm glad you said that about in person being easier, because it is, because you're confronted with Bruce Springsteen, but like his shoes untied or something, or something else. And you just think, whew, okay, like he's just a guy, there's always some little tell that reveals that they're just like an idiot, like the rest of us. And that's such a relief. It's harder on the phone.
Right.
Listening to you, it makes it sound like, gee, you guys have a great job. Everyone here might be like, I'd like to spend a week in Reykjavik. Like, this sounds awesome. So maybe you could tell people here, like, how on earth do you break into this, amazing sounding profession?
It is amazing. I mean, that's the other thing. I'm sort of agog every day that this is a job and that I get to do it. And, and I live in constant fear that, like, it's a classic imposter syndrome. Like, today's going to be the day that someone figures out that I have no idea what I'm talking about. And this will all be, yanked away. But yeah, it's for me at least, and I'm very excited to hear Will's response to this question. For me, it was always what I wanted to do. I mean, I grew up obsessed with music and obsessed with writing. It was like books and tapes. Like, that was what I spent all my money on. That was all my interest was funneled. I was just an obsessive listener and an obsessive reader. And I think at some point in middle school or high school, when I got my hands on my first copy of Spin or Rolling Stone and realized, like, oh my God, these two things can exist simultaneously. Like, you can write about music. It just, I never thought I would get to do this for a living, but I always knew that if, that it was the dream, like that I would do everything I possibly could to sort of try to make it work, to try to, get someone to let me write about the records and the songs and the artists that I loved, that changed my life. So, I started, I guess the first time I published a record review was in the Village Voice, which I think, and I imagine Will's story is somewhat similar. At the time, alt weekly,
nice,
small free weekly newspapers in big cities were the place where, like, they would take a chance on a young writer. They would take a chance on, in my case, it was an editor named Chuck Eddy, who was sort of beloved for, I think, taking a lot of chances on a lot of young writers. And I just sent him a million pitches probably, and eventually he responded to one and said like, all right, kid, like give it your best shot, and signed me a record with you. It was a Will Oldham record. He was a singer and songwriter from Kentucky who I loved and still love. And that was my first published piece. After that, throughout college, I was writing for my college newspaper. I started writing for Pitchfork back when that was still pitchforkmedia.com, and you had to kind of explain to your parents what a website was. Kind of that was really where I kind of came of age as a critic. Pitchfork's now a kind of big professional entity, but back then it was like a very scrappy website where I think we got paid like $10 a review, and it was run out of Ryan Schreiber's basement in Minneapolis and later Chicago. It just sort of clawed my way up from there. Had a lot of other jobs along the way, for sure, but was just always so kind of certain in my heart that nothing could ever be as fun as writing about music. And I still believe that now. I really do. Even on the days where I'm complaining or I'm on deadline or I'm tired or something's difficult or I'm just staring at a blank screen for 14 hours, I still feel so lucky and grateful to get to do this work.
Yeah, ditto. I'm never not grateful. I feel super, super fortunate. And it was always just something that writing about music was always just something that I would do. I wrote for the student newspaper, and I realized, wow, if you contact record companies, you can like get free records if you're writing about them. And so when I left college, I was like, oh, wow, how do I keep this going? So I started writing for Option magazine, which was a small magazine based out of Seattle at the time, and they published my first reviews. Editor Richie Unterberger, and I just kept doing it, and I had all these other jobs because I never thought that I could make a living as a writer. It just didn't. I didn't know a writer. I didn't know that was a legitimate job choice. I knew people did it. I just didn't think I could access that. Or that anybody would be interested in what I had to say. But I found these outlets that would publish me over the years, and I kept doing it. I had a column for the Windy City Times, an LGBTQ publication in Chicago, and then I joined I started my MFA at the University of Minnesota. And while I was, working on fiction and working on creative nonfiction, I was writing for the Alternative News Weekly in Minneapolis, City Pages, which was a fantastic publication. Shout out Terry Sutton, shout out Jim Walsh, shout out Steve Perry, where I, got my chops. And when I finished the MFA, I pivoted from academia and took a job there, and then did some freelancing. Wrote for the Village Voice, which was always my like gold standard of music writing back in the day, and yeah, then wound up getting a job at Spin magazine, which was another place where I had like incredible mentors, Saya Michael, Alan Light, colleagues with Karen Gans, John Dolan, and then working at Rolling Stone for many, many years, and now freelancing again. But writing about music it's never been like, it was never really something that I thought I could do. And I think having a career as a writer is never been easy. It's not like it's harder now than it was. It was never easy. And it's, I always supported myself in other ways until I looked into that City Pages job, and that was I was, that was late in the game for me. I was in my late 20s. So actually I was in my early 30s. So it's never a straight path, but I think if you I would have kept on writing freelance no matter what. So I think if you're committed to your writing, just plan on getting money from whatever hustle you need to find, and do the work, do the writing, get it done, get it out there somehow. If you can get paid, great. If you can't get paid, great. If you can only get paid a little bit, whatever. But just keep just keep doing the work. And in some ways in a lot of ways it's its own reward. If you make yourself open to luck in certain ways, you'll be more likely to be stuck with it, maybe.
It's great to hear, to end with sort of last words of advice. And so that was really useful, Will. And Amanda, do you have any final words of advice to students starting out now about how to envision a life like yours?
I mean, I guess my biggest piece of advice, and something maybe I wish I had learned a little bit earlier in my career, was to trust myself. I think as a listener, I think, and maybe this is kind of fading now, maybe this is sort of relic of when I kind of came of age as a critic, but I think there was this sense of I know there are bands and artists that I'm really supposed to like, things that are really cool and everybody else likes them, but I think that they sound boring, or I think that they sound cold, and I think it took me a long time to sort of learn that my thoughts and experiences were valid, and that I could believe in them, and maybe that's incredibly corny advice, but I think in some ways it's your currency as a critic, your sort of real and true reactions to things, your sort of honest understanding of how a song works and what it's doing to you. That's what you need to put down on the page. You can't kind of think about what's cool or what other people were saying or what maybe you wish you liked. I think you have to really sort of lean into, the reality of who you are as a listener and who you are as a person and what kind of connects with you. That was something I think I wish I'd been more comfortable with early on. But the second piece of advice I would say is you just have to write a lot, and you will get rejected a lot, and people will ignore your emails, and you have to find some sort of joy in the work itself, because that is what will sustain you. I mean, and for me, as much as I sort of gripe about, my job, as anyone would gripe about any job, writing is the best part of my day. It is always the best part of my day. I love the work. It brings me so much pleasure and joy and solace. And no matter what else is going on in my life, it provides a haven and something sort of beautiful, something that makes sense, something that I feel in control of. That to me is so crucial to kind of my, well-being as a human being on earth. So develop that, cling to that, work on that, find a way to love the work. If you don't love the work, I think all of the other sort of difficult parts of this job will really bring you down after a while. So you have to kind of hold on to and protect the joy that you find in listening to music and writing about music.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's, I think, a great way to end. And I just want to say to Will and Amanda, thank you so much for joining us here at Pitt. Thank you, Peter, for moderating. It was such a pleasure to have you. It was such a great conversation, so inspirational. And I really appreciate your lending your time and your insights for us. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Peter,
Yes.
Irina, everyone out there. This was such a treat, truly.
Thank you all, and I'm recovering from COVID, so I really appreciate sharing space, even if it's virtual, with people. And if I slipped into the COVID fog a little bit at points, all apologies. But thank you so much, Peter. Great questions, and Irina and Amanda.
Well, you're getting a lot of love in the chat, so I think there's a lot of appreciation. So thank you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor to speak with you.